static beat. Every ounce of blood's a fuzz to me.
So today, again, I want to introduce Elizabeth Humbert, who's an anthropologist, a collector of stories. She has a lot of insight that I'm really eager to hear about the life of Franz Boas and what it means for us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Our story begins on a dark and stormy night. This is not Franz Boas, but this is an image of the Baffin Islands. In the late 1880s, you can imagine this landscape, picture it in the dark of night. It was winter, so that means it was night all the time. Temperatures of about -50 Fahrenheit. You can imagine a young mid-20s German man with a traveling companion getting completely lost out in the ice and snow and having to run for like 26 hours before they could find themselves again. This was Franz Boas. In his diary after that experience, he wrote, "I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over that of the savages, and find the more I see of their customs that we have no right to look down upon them. We have no right to blame them for their forms and superstitions, which may seem ridiculous to us. We, highly educated people, are much worse, relatively speaking." And he went on to say, "All service, therefore, which a man can perform for humanity must serve to promote truth." So he had, at that point in time, he had spent, I actually don't know exactly how long, but he'd spent a while out in the Baffin Islands with the Inuit people, working with them, coming up against his own limits, the limits of his own knowledge, of his own skill, in living in that extreme environment, and coming around and around again and again to a respect for the skill and the knowledge and the traditions of the people who were constantly kind of helping him out to just survive. Franz Boas, the many faces of Franz Boas. He was born and educated in Germany in 1858. He was of delicate health as a child. I feel like that's a term we can only really use in the 1800s, but I kind of love it. He was interested in books of all kinds, especially natural history, real bookish kid. His grandparents were practicing Jews, but his parents were pretty secular. They were pretty liberal. His father respected the traditions of his parents, but he also was really committed to intellectual freedom. And so Franz Boas, you can imagine him just being this bookish little kid who would rather have his nose in a book than be playing outside. He was studying all kinds of sciences, and he continued in college. He was educated in Germany. He studied physics and math and geography. He got his doctorate at age 23 in physics with a minor in geography. And the geography minor, that's what brought him back out to the Baffin Islands where we met him. His sister said it was his first love that he returned to. So this interest in geography, this interest in the overlaps between our bodies and our minds, he came up against the limitations of his own body while he was studying physics. He couldn't tell the difference between certain solutions, the colors of certain solutions in his physics education. He was a little bit colorblind in that way. He was a little bit tone deaf as well. And so he was constantly thinking like, how is our experience of the world shaped by our bodies? How is our experience of the world shaped by our environment, from the geographic perspective? And so he already from a young age had a lot of cultural wheels turning. Anybody who's studied any cultural anthropology is going to notice some of the four fields popping up. And so he went out to, in his early 20s, he went out and he spent some time with the Inuits out in the Baffin Islands after a year of military service. And essentially, after doing some field work in the Pacific Northwest as well, while he was in the Americas, he kind of discovered culture, and he discovered language, and he discovered how much he loved those things. And so he started doing field work out in the Pacific Northwest with Native peoples out there, and then he decided to stay, and he made his career here in America, where ultimately he became the founder of American anthropology. How do you measure success? One of the ways to measure your influence in the world is to look at your students. And in Franz Boas's case, he has many, many heavy-hitting students. If any of you recognize these names, Zora Neale Hurston, Edward Sapir, these students went on to form the pillars of American anthropology, to lay the groundwork, to do incredible, groundbreaking work. Just to run through them briefly, Zora Neale Hurston, if we have any literature students in the room or lovers of literature, you're going to recognize her novels. She also was a folklorist. She did anthropological work in her own home in the South. Edward Sapir, very, very influential force in the study of linguistics and the founding of that discipline. Ella Cara Deloria, if you have ever heard of Vine Deloria and his incredible work as a Native studies theorist, Ella was his aunt, and she was a student of Franz Boas. Alfred Kraber, another extremely influential anthropologist, Manuel Gamio, he was a founder of modern anthropology in Mexico. He was a social activist and the leader of Mexico's indigenismo movement. I don't speak Spanish, so Spanish speakers here can correct my pronunciation. And then we have Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Melville Herskovitz, other just extraordinarily influential anthropologists. So Franz Boas really started an entire movement that then, it just launched a series of dominoes that essentially formed the bones of American anthropology, right? Now, notable among his student body is how many women there were and how many people of color there were. This is a time when academia is still to this day has problems in this area, but especially in the early 1900s, late 1800s, like this was not a very inclusive moment in academia. And so the fact that he had so many female students, so many students of color is really quite notable, that he was working with people that normally would not have gotten sort of an opportunity, a foot in the door. None of these people were perfect. They all have their flaws. They're all worth a deep dive in and of their own right. Franz Boas also was not perfect. He was not always the easiest mentor to work with. He could be overbearing. He could be insufficiently supportive in preparing students for fieldwork. His methodology has been criticized in certain ways. Also, he was a salvage ethnographer, which means that in an era when it was common to view Native peoples as dying out, he was among the anthropologists who were like, oh no, all of this tradition is dying out. Let's save it before it completely dies. Which, on the face of it, like at first glance, you could say, well, that's kind of a nice thing to do, right? To keep languages from disappearing, to keep traditions from disappearing, but is also not always respectful of the leadership and the agency and the rights of the people in question, who really should be guiding their own movements to preserve and keep their cultures alive. And so, Franz Boas has certainly received some criticism in those spaces, right? And I think that's fair and valid, and we can hold space for that. We don't need to have pure heroes in order to admire people and be inspired by them. Franz Boas has a lot to admire and a lot to be inspired by. He did really important work. And this brings us to the moment of his day. Scientific racism was a big deal when Franz Boas was coming up in the world. Eugenics was considered a valid frame of thought. This is the idea that some bodies, some minds are healthier than others. And in order to have a healthy society, we should probably only be reproducing the healthiest people. It's kind of like you would breed cattle to be as healthy as possible to create a healthy herd, right? It's kind of a gross idea, even just to say it out loud, right? But this was considered common knowledge. This was common sense. It was science. It was just science, right? Of course, if you have people having babies who have disabilities, probably the babies are going to have disabilities. And then what? Then you have a society full of people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. It's an abhorrent philosophy these days, but it was considered common sense. And the idea that society had a vested interest and a right to control who was able to reproduce and how, that was also considered common sense. In 1916, Madison Grant, we know this name from our political history, right? Madison Grant. He was also an anthropologist. He was also a eugenicist, and he published a book claiming that America used to be racially homogenous, in other words, racially pure, but that was being degraded by immigration. Now, was that ever true? Absolutely not. America was never racially homogenous. Never. Never before colonial contact, never after colonial contact. But that was what Madison Grant was saying. And he was also saying that Nordics like himself, in other words, white people like himself, were being replaced by quote unquote lower races. and would soon be extinct. Replacement, right? This is a theory we have heard this day and age. The book that he published was also a book that Hitler later called his Bible. So Madison Grant, inspiring Hitler. In 1923, 10 years before Hitler rose to power, Calvin Coolidge, the president, was saying similarly that America must be kept American. There was a lot of anti-immigrant prejudice and policy that was happening at that time. The Ku Klux Klan picked up that rhetoric, and they used that to commit unspeakable brutalities to people in the Jim Crow South, right? So like, this was eugenics, the philosophy and the practice was absolutely influential across society. Now, instead of accepting common knowledge is a pretty strong force. The things that everybody's like, obviously, right? Instead of standing by and accepting common knowledge, Franz Boas made himself a problem. He stood out against those theories. So while Madison Grant was measuring skulls to say, some skull shapes are better than others, and you can see why some people are smarter than others because of their skulls, and some people have more right to exist than others. Franz Boas was using he had measured skulls as well, and he was using his data, meanwhile, to say, oh, look at how different people are, and look how much skull shape can vary from generation to generation, suggesting that maybe the way our bodies are formed is a response to environment, and maybe it's not an indication of worth or value. And so, that's just one example. I want to run through really quickly, because this is an anthropology talk, we can't get away without talking about theory. Unilinear social evolution, the idea that societies, about unborn babies, they start at a certain shape and then they progress in these shapes and they go through child development and they get more sophisticated and more intelligent, or not more intelligent necessarily, but more developed, right? We go through this sort of biological development process. Well, people at the time were believing that societies were a bit like that too, where you start out, or like you could use an evolutionary metaphor, where like you start out as an amoeba, and then you become a lizard, and then you become something really nice, like a mammal, and then you grow and you become a human, right? Like there was this kind of idea that there was this progression from simple to complex, from less to more. And they had this idea that this is true of cultures too. So you can look around the globe and you could say, that one is kind of at stage X, and this one's kind of at stage Y, and then ours is really good. Ours is really nice. It's about as developed as you can get, of course, right? So Franz Boas was pushing back against this theory, and we'll talk a little bit more about how he did that in a moment. But that was a theory that he was adamantly opposed to, that again was really common knowledge at that time. Then there's the idea of replacement, the idea that white people in society were at risk of being replaced by people of color, by immigrants in particular. Franz Boas was not having that. He pushed back against that. He pushed back against the idea that eugenics is right and good and normal. By contrast, what did he promote? He promoted cultural relativism. So this is the idea that cultures are specific. You have to kind of judge each one on its own terms. You can't just compare like one to another. You can't put them in a line and rate them in a hierarchy. They're not like some are less evolved and some are more evolved. They're all equally modern. They're all equally evolved. They're all equally sophisticated. And you kind of have to understand them on their own terms. That was a big idea that he put forth that other anthropologists were not talking about very much. And that has become really a groundwork of the discipline today as it's practiced. Another one is historical particularism. Again, we're throwing this whole like evolutionary idea out the window, this idea that society is evolving along these set stages. Instead, we're going to say what your culture is like is a product of its specific history. Every culture, every society, whether it's written down or not, has a history, has changed over time. And those changes are specific to that place, and they need to really be understood on their own terms. And then also, eugenics is a very stupid idea. So all of this is to say, Boas was anti-racist at a time when racism was extremely on the upswing, right? He was anti-racist at a time when Hitler was taking notes from a former US president on how to be racist, right? And taking notes from a US anthropologist on how to be racist. This is an image of book burning in 1933 in Nazi Germany. Boas was anti-eugenics at a time when eugenics was considered, again, self-evident, common sense. He was actively, even if you can criticize some of how he did it or what the conclusions he drew, he was actively trying to preserve and validate the cultures of peoples in North America that the U.S. government was en route to extinguish. The U.S. was actively attempting to stamp out native cultures, and Boas and his students were actively trying to go and find out about those cultures and to do what they could to preserve them and keep them from dying out. He was in America, but he was German. During Hitler's rise to power, his nationality was not exactly popular. His views, as I've mentioned, were not popular. He was at Columbia University, where he taught. He was called un-American. The board of trustees at that university had him investigated for his opinions. Madison Grant and his allies worked really hard to get him fired. They cut his salary. They cut his department funding. They fired the faculty in his department, everybody except for him. They moved his offices to a small, inconvenient, kind of crap suite of offices. And they wouldn't let him teach undergraduates anymore because they didn't want him corrupting the youth, So all this is to say, it was not easy to swim upstream, but Franz Boas did. He was swimming upstream. And that helps to shape his history. So when Columbia pushed him out, essentially tried to make it less comfortable for him to stay than to go, he went to Barnard College and he made a new circle. And this time he made a circle of students who were outsiders, who were women, who were people of color, who were outside of the mainstream. And the power of that center, of that circle, went on to form modern-day American anthropology as it's practiced today. So it had a tremendous force, right? It wasn't until the end of World War II that the mainstream came to acknowledge that what Boas had been saying about eugenics and stuff was right, and that what common sense had been saying was wrong. Now, some people say, it's always a surprise to me, some people say that Boas is a matter of mostly historical interest, because he didn't write a ton of theory himself, unlike a lot of anthropologists. And he was involved in changing opinion on things that have since been sort of become stable knowledge, right? Like the idea that race is a construct, the idea that no culture is better or worse inherently than any other culture. Those are now sort of premises that we can all kind of agree on, right? And so it has been said that his relevance as a scholar has basically faded since World War II and eugenics and Nazis, because we fixed all that, right? So they say that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And I will say history is rhyming pretty hard right now. I'm not saying that 2026 United States is Nazi Germany, not by any means. There are lots and lots of very important differences between our society and the society that Franz Boas was living in at that time. But there are also broad themes in our political moment that are absolutely not new. I want to give a plug to this podcast I listen to a lot. It's called In Bed with the Right. And they did a series called the 1933 Project this year, or last year, 2025, where basically they did kind of like a walk through the year, juxtaposing the events of 1933 onto 2025. So in March of 2025, they did an episode on what was happening at this time of the year in 1933. And part of that idea was they wanted to show, it's easy to see everything in hindsight, in retrospect, but they wanted to show how it developed. And so the two hosts, Moira Donegan, Adrian Daub. Adrian Daub is a German man and a scholar of comparative literature and German studies. So he's a guy who knows what he's talking about, and he basically walks through the year. It's a really interesting ride, and I recommend it if you would like to do a deep dive on that. And as I said, there are really important differences between their moment and our moment, but there are also parallels to be found. So, just by way of example, we have military force deployed against citizens. We have ICE, which is functioning effectively like a secret police, asking citizens to show their papers on the street, at this point. killing people, whisking people away with no due process. We have a president that considers the press to be full of lies, as Hitler also did, and undermines institutional authority and knowledge, attacking institutions. We have a cadre of people who really believe in white replacement, who believe that that is a threat to them personally and that that is happening, and who believe that immigrants are to blame. And we have also groups in society, identities in society that are marked out and sort of exposed as unwanted and immoral, such as LGBTQIA plus people, but especially trans people who are, being legislated against, who are being made targets of. And so there's a lot that is happening right now that is parallel to the things that were happening in Franz Boas's day. And with that in mind, I think that Franz Boas, I think his relevance has not faded. I think I'm showing I was raised in the church, right? WWJD is the cliche. What would Jesus do? Well, allow me to be a little funny and say, what would Boas do, right? I think that that's a good question, actually, to be asking in this moment for our time. Boas believed in human equality. He believed in psychic unity, meaning there's no group of people, class of people, etc., who are inherently more smart or more valuable, more worth it than any other people. Okay, so like he believed that at a time when that was absolutely not popular and almost got him fired and did get him pushed out of his job to believe that. He believed in human variation, in diversity, in difference. He believed that it was important to understand our differences, not to be afraid of them, to go out and to dig deep and to learn all about them and to try to respect and preserve them, not to trample them and steamroll them flat. And then, most importantly, he did not stand back. He did not stay quiet. He made himself a problem. He had the courage to go against the grain, to swim upstream, even when it cost him huge sacrifices in his career, in his probably personal safety. I mean, if you have enemies like Grant Madison, or Madison Grant, sorry, it takes courage, it takes heart, and it takes clarity of mind as well, to be able to notice what is true, what is good, to have strong values, to be, as I say to my students all the time, to stay centered in your values, to know who you are and what you believe, and then to move from that place. That takes courage, that takes clarity. And that is what I wish for each of us in this room. Thank you. Lauren recommended a book, The Gods of the Upper Air. If you want a deep dive, it's like a paperback, right? And you can learn about him, his moment, his students, all the backstage gossip that was, because it was not a perfect group, right? But yeah, really, really great stories in there. So that would be a great place to start. Also, the Wikipedia page is full of stuff too. I mean, it's that as a starting point on a rabbit trail, if that's your jam, that's totally a good place to start too. It's almost uncanny how, again, it's not a repeat, but it definitely is a rhyme. And I personally feel inspired by seeing somebody who is willing to be weird in a room full of people who said you have to be normal, and to stand up and say, even if it costs me everything, I'm going to do what I believe in. And I think that's the courage we need right now, even though it, as you pointed out, it comes with cost and could come with cost. Yeah, and his students, right? Like his legacy, in many ways, his legacy was his students. I don't mean to say he didn't do a lot of writing. He did a lot of field work. He did a lot of work on linguistics and culture, but he was not an anthropologist who was sitting down and saying, here's my take on how it all works. Here's my master theory on how it all hangs together. Franz Boas, I really like this about him, actually. He was like, let's not get over our skis, let's stay centered on the data. And so he encouraged, and he got a lot of critique for this. He was like, rather than jumping into a theory too soon, go and just get the data and see what it tells you. And then, be very cautious. Like if it's disagreeing with the theory, follow the data instead of the theory. That was his way. That was really important to him. I think the really sad thing about that story that you pointed out, that the president is saying, like, we have the best culture. And, he's commented too on the word civilization of like, Western civilization or our civilization. And the thing that's really sad to me about that, in addition to the harm it's doing now, is that anthropology is who gave us those ideas to begin with. Anthropology is kind of guilty of introducing some of those ideas early on. In the early days of anthropology, that again, unilinear social evolution, that is the idea that of course our culture is best and it is the pinnacle and it is the most advanced. So like he's reaching back 70 years to common knowledge of 70 years ago. And among anthropologists, that's been debunked thoroughly. But it is still, these things, it's like when you do research, when you write theory, it goes out, it ripples out, and you can't control where it goes. And like all these years later, it's still in the ether. There's still something about those ideas that is attractive to people for certain reasons. And the idea of civilization, it's just a really fraught concept, as you know. So yeah, I think part of anthropology's responsibility at this time is to let people know, let lay people who are not deep in the theory, to know that like, no, there's, as I say, like if you had to boil it down to one phrase, it's there are a lot of different ways to be human. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing, right? There are a lot of different ways to be human. But it's, I think it's going to be a while before we can totally wash that out of the laundry, Yeah, so like the idea of obeying in advance, complying in advance, Franz Boas was absolutely against that. He was like, I am going to non-comply to the very last until they pry it from my cold dead hands, Franz Boas was raised by people who really believed in intellectual freedom. And you can see that in his own work as well. He it's funny, like Columbia, it's interesting that it's happening at Columbia because like that's the place where these protests are happening and they're cracking down on these protests where, you have students who have who want to peacefully speak out against an injustice and then they're being cracked down on and in some cases deported and, and you have, I just think that there's an opportunity for institutions to, rather than stand aside and allow these forces to steamroll over them or over us all, that institutions actually have a lot of power. They wouldn't be attacking universities if they didn't understand that universities are powerful. They wouldn't be targeting students, young people, if they didn't realize that students have a tremendous power, tremendous voice. It's not by accident. And like when they say that like, sometimes you hear this, that there's like intellectual homogeneity in a university where everybody's taught to all think the same thing and do the same thing. That's like, the university is the place where that's least true. If you think about your white collar job where you go to like, I don't know, be an administrative assistant or be a data analyst or whatever in a corporate setting, like those are good jobs, but like you are not going to be talking about politics at those jobs. You're not going to be talking about literature at those jobs, maybe in the break room, but that's not going to be the heart and soul of what you're doing there. Whereas at university, there is a lot of university that's organized around that. And so I think that it's a great mistake. I think that Franz Boas would agree that it's a great mistake to just give away that power rather than to do the uncomfortable thing and to just stand still while people are running at you, Yeah. Statistically, trans people are a very small percentage of the population. And I think that it is, for that reason, it's easy for the mainstream to say, yeah, that doesn't affect me, or that's not that important. But as we all know, first they came for so and so, and then they came for everyone else, and so yeah, I think it's really important when anyone any group is being unjustly singled out, I think that is all of our problem. Yeah, so the irony, I mean, I won't speak for the Burns Paiute on that. I think that whatever they said would be surprising. But the irony of these statements being made by people who are not indigenous to this land, in the presence of people who are indigenous to this land, that is a thick irony. And especially when you get Native people who are being, accused of being here illegally or not being US citizens or, being at risk of deportation. It is true that like some Native people have migratory routes where it is like in California, for example, it's not uncommon to be like indigenous to California may be part of your homeland and Mexico might also be part of your homeland. Like these things don't observe modern day political boundaries, but it is absolutely wild that Native people today are at risk of deportation from their own land. And yeah, just yeah. Yeah, the archaeological record is no less than 16,000 years, but that in itself is a Western perspective, and there are a lot of Native people whose answer would be we were created here. It's it doesn't the archaeological record can tell you not less than it can't tell you what the beginning was, and so yeah, that's a long presence, 16,000 years. End of the last ice age. That's a long presence here. Yeah, as long as you don't know that there are other people in the room, it is really scary, especially when your skin is on the line, like it is really scary to stand up, but we aren't actually alone in this. And even if we were, there's still an argument to be made. Like I don't know that Franz Boas felt that there were other people in the room, but when he got ousted from the room he was in, he went and found a different room and he gathered those people. And I think that there's something to be said for that as well. Yeah, when you're dealing with injustice, oppression, abuse, placating the attacker, I mean, it's up to every person to decide what kind of risk analysis they want to engage in. But like, the game is not won just by being really good at placating the attacker, because there's never going to be really a way to win that game. Yeah, and when one side is actively trying to mislead, it's like you have to control for that as well. Not to say that everyone who consumes that media and believes those messages is trying to mislead, but there are bad faith actors in that environment. And I think, like, again, that's why media has been attacked as much as it has, and undermined and sabotaged in many ways, because if the story is out, like it's only when the story gets out to the mainstream and people are aware of how egregious these things are that people then unite against it, right? Like, so there's yeah, that's a huge challenge for sure. This is a good thing. Franz Boas was one influential launch point. He wasn't the only one, but he was kind of a singular launch point in many ways. We have so many anthropologists now doing so much great work. I guess a very small answer to your question would be like, we've established that race is a construct, right? Race is a social construct. There is an anthropologist, if any of you are in my 110, you'll read this, but there's an anthropologist, Clarence Gravely, who published an article, and his thesis is that yes, race is a construct, but if you end there, you oversimplify things. There are biological characteristics that can be associated with different races, and these are a reinforcing cycle. So when you live in a body that is considered to be of a certain race and ostracized for that or treated in various ways, experiences injustice as a result of that, the impacts of racism show up in your body and can get carried from generation to generation. And so, is race a construct? Yes. Does race have biological impacts? Yes. So can you see the impacts of race in the body? Yes. And these things are part of the same whole and need to be addressed as a whole. So I guess that's sort of an example of how an idea that Boas was really championing, this idea that race is a construct, sort of has been iterated on and further developed more recently.